What's up, guys, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Robbie Cassidy, and today we have a repeat guest on. We have Dr. Lorcan Daly. It's great to be able to call you that now that it's gone through and all. How are you doing?
I'm good, Robbie. Great to see you now. Good to be meeting you in person again after 2 years, I presume, or something like that.
Exactly. We did. I know we did, the last one we did was over Zoom, and it works well. But sure, when you came down to Clare, we were saying you may as well jump on one, and we'll talk through a few things, because I think it's a lot easier to kind of get the conversation flowing when it's not through Zoom. You know, you kind of just stop and start and that.
Yeah, I think we did the last two in Zoom, so it must be at least 2 years. I think they were a year apart, anyways, or more.
Jeez, yeah, it's a long time.
Like that, yeah,
it's a long time. Because I was in actually Tenerife for the first one, and I was in Bali for the second. But come here, what we'll do is, how is your summer going? Now we're recording this end of the summer, so it probably won't be released for a couple of weeks. But how has your summer been going so far? What have you been up to?
Yeah, very good. So I suppose I was very busy at the start of it, just finishing the PhD, and then in with Offaly then. There's a bit of an overlap there, but that's obviously finished up now for the season, so just working with a club at the minute, Castle Daly, and so it's just to have, I suppose, a bit more quiet time after all that kind of busy period. So it's good to have a bit of time for myself just to do things, even go back to the family and do other things of that. I went away to England there for a few days, met other cousins and things, so it's nice to just, I suppose, have a bit of normality again after a very busy period where you've been putting on a lot of late nights and things like that, getting things done and numerous deadlines and all, so it's good to kind of reset again, I suppose.
Yeah. And when you, just to jump onto that, you were talking about, because we were talking about being in with Offaly, and we were talking about the professionalism of a inter-county club, or an inter-county team, I should say. And it's interesting, the stuff that you're doing with them. What type of stuff are you, or have you been looking at the last while, or what type of thing, like what's your position there with Offaly at the minute?
Yeah, so strength and conditioning coach, I was last season, so essentially that's you're I suppose, what you, for want of a better term, a kind of physical preparation or physical trainer, thing like that. So you're designing the gym programs. You might have guys for return to play, you'll take them for runs, you'll do the warm-ups, cool-downs, things like that, or any kind of top-up runs where needed. And as well, you'll chat. Obviously, it's a kind of multidisciplinary team you have, so you'll engage regularly with the physio, you'll engage with the coaches, and maybe design session structures, things like that, session durations. You'll chat about certain guys who might be injured or coming back and other things. As well, I link with the nutritionist Brendan Egan, and we'll see maybe adapt some training for some guys looking to lose fat, or we say gain muscle or whatever. Obviously in season now, most of them are maintaining or whatever the goals are at the time for whoever. And then it's essentially a brilliant experience. Learned a huge amount just dealing with all the different coaches, and the setup was very good. So brilliant experience, and I certainly learned a lot and enjoyed the whole process.
Yeah, and it was the footballers you were in with, was it?
Yeah, the senior footballers. So we had a good run of it up to the Charlton Cup semi-final and a long enough season, so certainly very enjoyable.
Good. Yeah. I suppose what did you take away being with that kind of, being with an inter-county team or being with such a professional team? What were your takeaways? I know you're at Castle Daly now, and I know obviously they're are they a senior club, is it?
Intermediate now in Westmeath, yeah.
So there's obviously a big difference between the two of them and the structure of it all. That what were some of the things that you noticed with the inter-county team?
Yeah, I suppose you've a lot more resources at your disposal. You've even, the likes of Team Builder for programming things, or you've different softwares and other things, and the fact that you're dealing with such a large team. You've the nutritionist there, like I said, you've other guys. And I suppose just the thing is more competitive to a degree. You've more guys competing for places, and it's just, I suppose, that bit more serious, and just the competitive environment is at a higher level because you have such a large team, and because of course it's a kind of a higher level of a game at that inter-county standard, which is basically almost professional in the modern game. So certainly very interesting. But again, most things are very similar from club to inter-county, but probably the big difference is the amount of resources you have at your disposal to use and things like that, and the professionalism, I suppose.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned something actually that we were chatting about of even a manager's role in an inter-county squad is more of an actual management role of you taking care of the people and putting the right people in the right places. I know obviously with a club team, your manager kind of is a be all and do all. They do everything, take the sessions, and I know obviously more when you have selectors and stuff like that, it changes a small bit. But I thought that was an interesting one, as I've heard it a lot of times, even with the Clare hurlers and stuff like that they talk about how the manager is more, I guess it is a management position as opposed to on the field position, putting in the, not to say they're not putting in the work, but to be calling sessions and stuff like that. You were saying that there's a couple of coaches in place for that.
Yeah, it's definitely, I suppose people might think of them as a coach themselves, which they are to an extent, but essentially their main thing is to assemble the team and manage the team. So certainly there's a lot of work involved in that, and just getting the right people in for the right jobs, and just essentially being another person to oversee and kind of see where things might need to be tweaked or whatever, and have certainly another input. But there is, again, probably a lot of the intercounty teams would have coaches and other guys running the sessions.
Yeah.
But the manager may or may not have certain roles in the actual daily running of training sessions. Depending.
Yeah, I think it really, that's something that club teams, obviously they don't have the same resources and the same amount of backing and that for it, but there's definitely a position in club teams that the manager probably in some situations takes on too much, and I even see it sometimes with teams that I've worked at in the past, and when they take on too much they get into sometimes in a position that they start telling the people who know what they're doing what to do, like, so they'll be telling physios what to do, they'll be kind of advising strength and conditioning coaches what to do, and I think that's a massive mix up then with, like, when you have that type of an interplayer when they're kind of encroaching on someone else's profession. But you were saying in the situation that you were in, it was very well run.
No, 100%. Yeah, no, it was brilliant. I suppose you do keep an eye on things, certainly, but obviously you need to have the degree of trust. So there is certainly a balance. I'd say that you're letting kind of people do their own thing, but make sure that obviously a manager or whatever will have a lot of common sense and have seen a lot of stuff before, so they'll know where things might need to be improved or whatever. So it's just finding a balance really, but not obviously doing too much either, like you said.
I
think
that's good. And what were your takeaways from the season? What, just yourself from working with that team? I know you come from obviously a sports background and a research background. Putting things in place, what did you learn from it, or what did you pick up from working with either team, even just on the day to day and working with players and working with stuff like that? Like, how did you that you picked up?
I suppose, yes, it's a very good question, but hard to pinpoint exactly. I think just I learned a lot of how things work in a practical sense at that level, and just kind of managing. You might have to tweak things based on real world scenarios. You've different guys at different levels, so obviously some lads that have certain strengths and things, so you have to individualize certain things, tweak things, and there's always going to be some degree of modification depending on fixtures and things like that, and you're constantly looking at your environment and seeing what's the best decision you can do and have an impact now. So obviously in theory it can be, when you're studying or whatever, you can have all this grand plan or whatever to do, but you certainly need to be able to respond to the environment, what's going on, where lads are coming from, and then just kind of make decisions, and have that kind of have a backing that what you're doing is the right thing, and then just essentially implement the best that you can for what's in front of you.
Yeah,
I suppose. So that's the big thing, where you learn really that you can see and adapt and tweak things just to suit what you need at the time.
Okay, and is there anything then anything in season that may have cropped up and you would have seen it? Obviously I know there's obviously a certain level of confidentiality and stuff like that, but
yeah.
I mean, anything that you had to find, that you had to adapt between Offaly and between Castle Daly and other teams that you had worked with, anything that you noticed that it was a point that maybe a game was changed and you had to restructure training or restructure gym programs, or even with fixtures changing, I suppose would be the big one for me, or guys getting injured and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I suppose when you've guys injured and things like that, they're on different timelines, so you might have to modify certain running things to get them back with a set date in mind. So you'll obviously link with the physio there and you'll say, we need them back here at X date, and then try and work towards that. So you'll try and oftentimes you'll find you're thinking of the date ahead, the next match or the next whatever, and then just work backwards from that. And then you have with the gym programs that you're obviously, you don't want them to detrain, so you want to give them enough of a stimulus that they're keeping their strength, power, speed, whatever, but obviously you don't want any overlapping fatigue, so you're managing that a good bit. You might have to tweak the gym days, or you might have to, we'll say, have a deload. Well, obviously you'll have deloads kind of planned out or whenever you need them, but you might kind of adapt certain sessions depending on matches, whether it was a Friday or whether it was a Saturday or a Sunday game, something like that. You might slightly change. And similarly then with training structures, you might have to adapt those. So if you had, we'll say, from a Sunday to a Saturday game, you might go at a Wednesday training, versus if you had an extra day or two, you might include a Tuesday, Thursday. So you have to be able to think and just kind of plan backwards from a date. Seems to be kind of the main thing, and just work backwards. You need to have the guys primed and in full condition at this time point, and then work from that.
And with it then, how would you adapt a gym program? What way would you look at that? Like, what kind of changes would you
Yeah, so I suppose if you had a tighter turnaround, you just might reduce the load, particularly in the second day, something like that. So it might be just a bit of an easier session, or even some kind of priming session, just to keep them a bit sharp going into the match. So obviously you don't want to give them a good hard session maybe a day or two before and have them anyway sore.
Yeah.
So it's just about managing that, and then of course managing their training load and things like that, and keeping an eye. So obviously we'd just keep an eye on the wellness, other things like that, the responses to training, and make sure the guys are ready to go when you need them.
Yeah. And is it something that you could see yourself doing into the future, continuing with the, I know you were talking about looking for positions in different domains, but would you see yourself kind of being connected to that side of it, or do you prefer the academic side, or how would you like a mix, or how would it?
Yeah, I like them both, I suppose. So I'd probably like ideally to have a mix of the two. I think they both make you better in each separate domain. So you could just, if you were exclusively in academia, you can kind of become a bit detached from the field, and you can become out of touch a bit. But if you're working regularly in the field, I think you can see the problems. You can see, we're not too sure which of these is better, and maybe if you're doing that in the field and you see that, then you can use your own research. Well, let's try both and see which is a better option, or try both training, or try two different running programs, see which gives you better results. So I think you need having that mix is certainly good. In sports science especially, I don't know who said this or some tweet or something, but that there's so much data out there, and it's kind of answering questions that nobody has. Like you can be comparing things, that two things that don't necessarily matter or might never be implemented in the real world. And there's data out there, right, and people analyze it, but it's more about asking good questions and seeing, well, what if you answer this question a certain way, is it actually going to change how you're training, or what you're doing for recovery modalities or whatever, and is it going to have a real world impact? And that's kind of the thing to be looking at. So that'll be my goal, if it could be done at all, just to continue research, but also keep the eye in terms of the practical setting, so what I'm actually doing has relevance, I suppose. Yeah,
it's applicable as well. Like, what when we were talking, to jump onto cold water exposure, because we went for a swim last night. God, it was chilly, but when we were coming out, I was talking to you about how my own team there, because we're very close to the coast, we're only maybe 5 minutes away from the beach or 10 minutes away from the beach. With that, like a lot of the time, players are looking to go down and get a swim. And now when I'm looking at it from a recovery aspect, I look at it from more of the mental side, how it can help hopefully promote better sleep and all that. But you were saying that you can offset. It's more of a short-term improvement, but when you're looking at long-term adaptations, it may have a bit of an effect.
Yeah, so I suppose, funnily enough, we were out yesterday and I actually got stung by jellyfish now, so I'm not sure if that's a thing we'd have to watch for, guys. But yeah, no, I think, as you said, there's the kind of short-term and long-term lens to view it. Like, again, as I was even saying, there's a lot of mixed results with the cold exposure, and it highly depends on the type of fatigue that's been induced. Or, for example, if you're doing gym sessions and then you implement cold water after it, that can actually reduce the strength gains or hypertrophy gains, and that's kind of well established now. So, but in terms of aerobic sessions, things like that, it has much less of an effect. There's even some things that saying it could actually potentially promote, other things that say it might potentially blunt things to some degree. So it's hard to know exactly, but the logical thing when you see that is to maybe avoid cold exposure after, we say, resistance or gym sessions, and then you could implement it after, we'll say, aerobic or things like that. But in terms of like a match or regular team training or whatever, there's obviously a lot of acceleration, decelerations, and there'll be a lot of muscle damage and things like that. But so if you have a hard training and then you have a match in a day or two's time, it could be a good idea then to use the cold water just to, we'll say, clear some of that inflammation or reduce the fatigue or muscle damage from that, or not necessarily reduce it, but just blunt it to some degree so that you're increasing your readiness to perform in the next day. So it's nearly the way I'd use it is just, we'll say, the day before a match, something like that, after training, the final training, so that they're fresh during the match. But I'd be of the opinion that in the long term, it's it's a tool to use maybe in season, but if you're doing it pre-season or far away from beyond league, I don't think it has much utility. I think it actually could lower your fitness, because essentially I suppose it's when you're exercising or have a training, that's going to cause immediately a negative response, fatigue and muscle damage, and that's going to promote adaptations. But if you're, we'll say, utilising these recovery things maybe too often or too long in the year, it's probably taken away some of that fatigue but then you're obviously going to not get as much adaptation from it. So it's all about the context, I think, and using it when it's important, when you need to be fresh. But when you're trying to get fitter or stronger, don't use it, I would say.
Again, the thing is, like, it's so common. Like, how often do you see people going for ice baths, cryo chambers, stuff like that after training? And the fact that there's a negative adaptation to it. I've stopped with injuries as well. I don't give people ice rarely after an injury, for the same reason, in that it blunts the response when they need the response to be as effective or as efficient as possible. You don't want to be waiting 24 hours before it can get actually a proper response, or probably 6 to 8 hours in a lot of cases, because people are icing it, causing that vasoconstriction. The markers aren't being put in place for healing, and then obviously you're delaying it by a day or two. So I've actually completely avoided that with all my players, and what we do instead is just get them moving, try get them walking around, try get them moving the area a small bit more, see where the actual injury is, because obviously when an injury happens you have an overprotective response. Like for an ankle ligament, you could say the ligament isn't as long as I'd say from your fingernails. I know it's probably a small bit longer than that, probably 2 or 3 fingernails long, but at that's the only little bit that's been injured, yet the whole ankle blows up. The whole ankle gets really, really sore. So just by, instead of icing it and trying to take down that pain in the moment, look at trying to get it moving a small bit more, work the natural systems in the body where you can work your lymphatic system and clear out the drainage, or to help it drain better, and clear out the bad stuff there. But I think a lot of people are falling back on things like that. Maybe it's from, I think it's word of mouth really is how they spread a lot of the time, and social media. Foam rolling is another big one. People push on that so much. Is there any other ones that you were going into it, and you, like any other recovery modalities that you were researching, and you found out similar to that there was actually maybe a negative effect of overusing it as well? Did you come across anything else as
I think a few interesting things I found as well. Some of it can be in the dose that's administered. Like a lot of the research that sees, for back to the cold water, the ice baths, that sees negative effects, they use a very extreme, very low temperature for a long time.
Oh, really?
So it could have a massive dose of it, whereas maybe a smaller dose might have a different effect. So it's not just the thing is it good or bad, it might be the amount of it or the intensity of it. So even for like a much less researched modality is kind of heat exposure, essentially. So there's a lot on cold water, ice baths, things like that, but not so much on heat. But for example, you'll have conflicting findings. There is a few studies looking at sauna as a recovery modality, but that can actually exacerbate things to a degree that you're probably causing more fatigue immediately. So in terms of being a recovery modality, going in for an intense sauna is probably just going to get you more dehydrated, fatigued. But whereas there's other research looking at less intense heat, actually has a benefit for returning your performance or improving your recovery. So things like that, it's if you maybe too high of a dose might have a negative effect, whereas a lower dose, and it is very complicated. We don't necessarily know 100%. There is some guidelines. I think for the cold water it's something like 10 to 12 degrees for, I think, around 10 or so minutes is kind of the recommended for recovery, things like that. But there is a lot of contextual variables and different things for different times, and again there's an awful lot less on the heat. But again, there's something on that. Dr. Robin Thorpe had a nice study looking at potentially using different modalities for different types of fatigue. Again, there's not that much research on it, but it would be interesting to see his suggestion there is possibly after resistance training you can go with a light heat just to aid blood flow, because I suppose essentially resistance training you're looking to increase anabolic signal, and a slight increase in blood flow might aid recovery and also potentially improve the signaling, whereas cold would have the opposite effect, vasoconstriction. And then, as we said, so that could be resistance, you could go with a heat, and then for the like of an endurance session you could go with a cold. Another thing with the cold water or ice baths, it can actually stimulate mitochondrial, I think, number and density potentially, something like that, so which could further increase aerobic adaptation. So could be a benefit to, depending on the type of exercise, you can go with a different type of modality to suit it.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense actually, doesn't it? Because I know with sauna use there is at a certain, I think it was like 180 degrees for 20 minutes, that there's certain increases in like testosterone, growth hormone, stuff like that. mTOR, maybe you know about that a bit better than me, I remember seeing it, signaling and stuff. But basically, I think that makes a lot of sense, because I think trying to isolate it and say all physical performance is going to be improved by, we know, like standard diet, sleep, hydration, stuff like that, that's obviously going to affect it. But when you're looking at the finer margins, then you do need to be more specific. And I think that it comes as well, what you said there, and correct me if I'm wrong, did you say sauna for high intensity resistance and then cold water exposure for more endurance based stuff? Is that what you were kind of
no, even just in terms of recovery, it could be, we'll say, just even a warm shower could be good after resistance, something even not too strenuous at all. But I think in terms of like a recovery in the context of you do an exercise and you want to be recovered in 2 or 3 days, I think any intense sauna heat is probably actually going to delay your recovery a bit. So, but a gentle heat, maybe a warm bath, something relaxing, not too strenuous, after a resistance training session could be a good option. Or then something similarly on the opposite end, then the cold after endurance session could give you a boost. Yeah.
And for long term use then, because I know like cold is better for short term,
yes,
as you were saying.
Yeah.
So for long term use, even though sauna delays the response because it adds more to it, do you feel that then you're getting the longer term benefit from it? Because I know there's cardiovascular change.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, that's exactly it. And in the long term context, including sauna, it's probably almost the equivalent of adding slightly more cardio work, because it stimulates red blood cells, greater blood plasma, things that are associated with endurance performance. So if you're maybe not getting enough of a stimulus from your regular training, you could include sauna. That'll give you a bit more stimulus, and things like that, and it could just boost your aerobic capacity slightly. I suppose other things, if you're looking at matches in the summer, sauna could be a thing that could help condition you to the heat. If you're used to sauna, you're probably going to be able to play better in hot conditions. There is some work in soccer players. I think they got them conditioned with saunas, and then they were, I think, better able to deal with hot conditions in somewhere in the Middle East, very hot conditions, and they were better able to cover more distance, things like that. So it's like, Anthony, if you're become accustomed to the demands you'll face, you'll probably be able to deal with them better during competition.
Yeah, like with anything, exactly as you say. I know I had a nutritionist on, Mike Nicholson, a couple of weeks ago, or probably a couple of months ago at this stage, and he was talking about that as well, about fasted training and dehydrated training, and how it has an effect in making you better at training when you're in a fasted state. You use, now I'm going to butcher it, but I know he was saying you use your stores more efficiently if you're fasted training, which helps you, or the same thing as if you're doing dehydrated training. It's a similar idea. You get better at able to use it without, or better able to train without water. I think that's the standard with the body. If you pull back on something for a small while, it's in the dosage as well, you usually get better at it. Like you don't overtrain, but you go to the gym, do your resistance training, you're fatigued, you sleep well, and then you get stronger. Simple. Like you do your sprints, you get better at that. With anything, and it's across the board. One thing that it just popped to mind there now, and I know this is more like in the moment recovery, and I just thought of it there because I've training tonight. That's why I thought of it. Is that, do you ever hear the idea? You mentioned red blood cells. The idea of holding your breath for a contraction of your spleen. Have you ever heard that?
I never heard. No.
So like, same again, I don't want to butcher it, but it's Patrick McKeown, and the Oxygen Advantage is actually that book over there. In that book he basically talks about how to improve everything, how to improve your breathing, how to improve oxygen transfer and all that. It's very, very good. But one of the things that he mentions in it is using breath holds to improve endurance performance.
Okay.
So it just came to my mind there. Basically, if you're breathing too fast, when you do hard running and then you're breathing really fast, you're actually blowing out all your CO2, so you can't take up any oxygen. So that oxygen transfer is really affected. So he's talking about like inhaling and holding, so you can give it a chance. But another one that he mentions in that book, and I just kind of clicked there with me, is that if you use that, I'm just thinking, if you had twice in a training session, if you used it just at the start after the warm up, you held your breath. He basically does a medium air hunger, where you're holding it until you really, really need it. A medium to max air hunger, I think it is, for the breath hold specifically for this one. And you get that extra release of red blood cells from your spleen if you do it. So it's like taking a shot of EPO.
Jesus, I've never heard this. Yeah.
So it's like holding your breath long enough that your body is thinks that it needs more.
Okay.
Needs more red blood cells. Obviously releases it, but then they get pulled back in very quickly. So I think it's within a couple of hours they get pulled back in again. But I'm just thinking, if you use that as you use that to try adapt your training, and you did a breath hold at the start of training, and then in the middle of training, at two different stages, if you're a long distance runner or if you're a football player or hurler, whatever sport you're playing, that there is some element of endurance in it. I'm just wondering, you'll get better at doing that then, so you'll get more release of your red blood cells. Spleen will obviously get stronger, contractions. I don't know why I'm gone down this rabbit hole here, but it just popped into my mind when you said that, and I think I'm going to say it at training later on.
No, Jesus, very interesting. Something very similar now. I think of similar thinking, but there's a bit on it now. Is that if you do an extended period of training with very low carbohydrate intake, your body will respond. It'll start producing more mitochondria, and then when you get back to your regular carbohydrate, you'll be much more efficient, and you'll have more mitochondria, which is obviously very well associated with endurance performance, aerobic capacity. So that's kind of becoming a training modality that's widely used. Training in a low carb state, it'll push the body to produce more mitochondria, and probably similar kind of logic with altitude training and all these kind of extra things that'll push the body to another limit, and then you'll have an adaptation from that.
Jesus, yeah, that's a really interesting one. So how would for anything that you had read, or if it even remembers, like, what were they? Do you know how they were programming that? Was it like week on, week off? Was it like 4-week block, 6-week block?
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I'd imagine an extended period, a few weeks maybe, of just training with, say, hard maybe distances with low carbohydrate intake, and then just the body responds by producing more mitochondria just to produce energy.
Yeah.
And then when you come back to regular state of nutrition with your regular carbohydrate intake, you have all these extra mitochondria that are going to utilize energy more efficiently during exercise. So it's just like a period of same concept, I suppose. If you're altitude training under conditions of lower oxygen, your body will adapt to that, and then when you come back to the regular oxygen state, you'll be perceived to have a lift or whatever.
Really? Yeah. Okay. That's because all these things, funny, these are all kind of popping to mind now. Is that, do you know Cal Dietz, the guy who made that triphasic programming?
I know that. Yeah, I know of him. Yes. Yeah.
He had one as well. That what he did with athletes, like, he's fairly high level. Like, I think he was at USA weightlifting team for a while, maybe the weightlifting or the wrestling team. I don't know exactly which one. And then he's over the college team as well in Minnesota. Maybe he's changed now, but he had one thing that he put him through a hard training session, and then he'd make them sit in a squat position where it helped them. I'm trying to think of exactly what he was trying to do. His thing was trying to help them to what's that where you dampen lactic acid? What's that called? Oh Jesus, I can't. It was in that podcast at Mike as well that he talks about it. It's like dampen lactic acid or dampen the hydrogen ions, the effect that it's having on the muscle. So it's obviously burning them, it's stinging them, but it's improving their ability to get rid of it faster.
Okay, right, yeah.
And buffer lactic acid.
Okay, improving their buffering capacity.
Yeah. Which was an interesting one, I thought.
Yeah.
And how do you know? Have you ever looked into that or heard about anything like that of how you would improve buffering capacity?
I think generally kind of training modalities to improve that. You might get something like 3 to 4 week block of very high intensity stuff. So in terms of gym work, it might be high rep stuff that you can get accustomed to that. So this kind of burn sensation, or things like sprint interval training, very high intense bursts, repeated bursts, repeated sprints, something like that. Essentially, it's this burn sensation you feel that you have this accumulation of hydrogen ions. And actually, even prior to studying for my Viva, having looked in a bit with the kind of metabolic indices of fatigue and things like that, it's nearly less. There's some work that's saying it's nearly less so the accumulation of hydrogen ions, and it's actually this amount of inorganic phosphate is causing this burn kind of thing. But I think a similar idea anyways. But yeah,
Right.
this kind of high intense training, for you can get away with it for 3 or 4 weeks, but after that the gains kind of plateau a bit.
Okay.
But that's the sort of timeline you can implement, and you get very rapid increases, of fitness in a very short period. But then it plateaus a bit, so you might have to look to some other modality after that.
And when you say, so like, explain to me, because I'm an absolute novice when it comes to it. When you say buffering lactic acid, well, I know it says the funny things that started with lactic acid, then it went to hydrogen ions, and now it's gone to phosphate. It's funny that they keep getting smaller and smaller. What's burning? What does that mean, like, to buffer? Is that just be able to get rid of it faster?
Yeah, it's essentially just manage the pH level, we say, of the muscle, or kind of clear them, or deal with all these kind of. So you'll have a big accumulation, but within and around the muscle in the blood. It's just to have the capacity to buffer, which essentially means just to balance out and potentially deal with all these metabolites, and kind of, we say, remove them or whatever, deal with them.
Okay.
And then just take the muscle back to regular pH, regular conditions faster, maybe.
Okay. And with what you were just talking about there with the 4-week block of high intensity, when would you do that in season? Like, when would it be?
Yeah, so I'd probably do it late, somewhere like pre-season maybe. It'd be kind of the finishing touches, because you can't, would say, extend it for too long. So you might, in terms of run, I think it could be, longer, slower distances, and then you start to really ramp up the intensity, and you have some kind of work that would be associated with improving buffering capacity at the kind of later stages, just to really get them to at their maximum level, and then maybe start into the season and something like that. Yeah.
And can that be sustained over the season? Or are you kind of looking at building a good base of it, and then from keeping it from just normal training?
Yeah. So in general, you'd probably look to build a good base of it over the number of weeks, and then you can. I might personally implement it with just as top-up work included again, but you'll get probably a lot of the stimulus just from when you get to the in-season phase. You'll have so many matches and other things. You'll have enough of a stimulus there, but obviously where needs be, if depending on minutes played or many other factors, guys' fitness levels or return to play, whatever multitude of factors, you might implement sessions here and there where needed, just to keep the balance.
Okay. And to just, I know just to rewind to it again, because so I get a good idea myself with it, is you do high intensity, like sprint interval training or resistance based training, where it'd be hypertrophy based. Yeah,
I suppose just in the context of resistance training, like you might say buffering capacity of, we say something like a 20 rep, something like that.
Really? Yeah.
But that's, I suppose you wouldn't do that necessarily with players too often.
Yeah.
Certainly you want to be doing it very far away from the season, I'd say. But yeah, no, it's more a kind of tool for hypertrophy or something like that. If you're going between rep ranges, that'd be certainly something to do in the off season, if ever at all you'd go to those kind of things.
Yeah. I know the one thing about it is, I suppose, in moving in that, just what you're talking about with that phase, it would really want to be far out, because I know now. This is Pavel Tazzolini that was talking about. That guy who's over strong first, kind of introduced the kettlebell to America.
Yes, yeah. The Russian guy.
The Russian guy, yeah. He interesting character, definitely is opinionated. So you'd have to take some of them with a pinch of salt. But his thing was that if you're training strength and you're getting that burning feeling, that it actually offsets the strength adaptation and affects it, because of the way that the hydrogen ions affect the adaptation. I don't know exactly now. Did you ever hear of anything about that or like that?
Yeah, well, I suppose if you're training for strength, you should be probably on the lower end of reps, and if you're getting a burn sensation, you're probably on the higher end of reps, I suppose. So
yeah.
So you could be right. You're probably just too far away from what you're doing, maybe.
Yeah. So okay, so they're two different adaptations. Like you're looking.
Yeah. I would say, even if you're doing these kind of high rep things, they can nearly stimulate hypertrophy, but that could slow you down in the short term. And that if you're training for hypertrophy, you could actually be running slower. So it's more the long term game you're thinking with hypertrophy stimulus.
Okay.
Whereas strength, you're kind of more in that transition, and then down to power then or whatever.
And is there a benefit then for training, going for a good block of hypertrophy training, then working into your strength and then working into your power? Like, will the adaptation from the hypertrophy training, let's say where muscle growth and you're just bigger, you're putting on weight, can you bring is there a certain level of strength that you can have, like naturally? Let's say, would you be best just to train strength training all year round and try to get as strong as possible, or is there a benefit of stopping the strength training, build up as much muscle as you can, then build up the strength after it, and then build the power into that?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. People are very opinionated on it. Even John Kiley there would have lots of work saying that, what is periodization, and there's different definitions of it. And
John Kiley over Limerick.
Yeah,
Really?
he's a lot of work on periodization. But I would lean towards that you should have some variability, and that logically I can see it that you could include certainly some hypertrophy work further away, and then just would say reduce loads, as you said, go into a kind of strength phase or something like that. But it doesn't have to be necessarily that black and white. But I think just in the process of having some variation in your training, and when you reverse engineer what you're doing, that you're probably going to have hypertrophy further away from when you're at a peak or near competition. So then it just kind of follows that roadmap that you're going to do hypertrophy, probably more strength, and then probably more power.
Yeah.
But you can have some mix and overlap. But in my mind, that's how I would program, and that I have that sort of a general roadmap. But I would include some variants and things like that.
Yeah.
But in terms of a ballpark area, that's kind of the way I would do it, anyways.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting about John Kiley. I hadn't realised that he was tied into the research that way.
Yeah, he's a lot of very interesting work on just the philosophies of periodization, how they came about from Matveyev or whatever the other guys in Russia designing them and things like that, and essentially saying that there's actually not that much set in stone research backing it, and I'm definitely butchering his opinions here, as you say, but there is, I think, more to be found, and depending on the athlete's level, even as you said, depending on the guy's level, if they're already quite big, then there's probably, you don't need to work on more hypertrophy. You probably just need to get more strength or power in, or if the guy has low levels of muscle mass, it probably doesn't make sense to just do more power. You might need to work more on strength or size. But I certainly think if you're just only working in that strength zone and not putting on size, depending on the context of the athlete, of course, but I think eventually things will peter out a bit, and you will need some variation.
Yeah.
So
that's it. Okay, that's interesting. So have you read some of his research? Have you kind of looked into it a bit?
Yeah, I have a bit now. He's a lot on just assessing periodization as a concept, and the term gets potentially misused and things like that, and there is issues with some things, and maybe not as much research as people would like to think. But I think the same with anything in sport or physiology, it's highly complex. There's so much contextual variables, what's going on exactly. So best we can just kind of use what we have, and then use your own tools as a coach, what you have in front of you, and then just kind of try and pick the best path for the athlete, I suppose.
And if you were kind of breaking it down in the back of the napkin, kind of very general way of kind of looking at a yearly setup for a GA player, let's say, or good GA, and then we might do running even just for the crack, like. But let's say September, they get knocked out of championship end of September, start of October. What's the plan from start of October until they get back to championship, in a very open way? Like, you don't have to say this and this.
Yeah.
In a very open way. Like, what do they start working on at the end of the September? What do they look into then as it gets closer to January? Obviously, the league starts probably February, March.
I
was going to say April. But yeah, like, let's say around March is probably a better time for it. What's a kind of general frame to look at over those blocks?
Yeah, I suppose immediately after they're knocked out, I suppose you'd certainly like to give them a break. I mean, it's a long season already.
Yeah.
For want of a term, they'll probably go on the liquid diet for a while, whatever, just to relax. But then I suppose when you're getting back into it, so maybe give them the few weeks, 2 weeks at least, maybe just to get just fully reset. Even psychologically, I think there's a lot of benefit in that. Switch off for a while. I'm sure they're probably sick of the WhatsApp going all the time, and there is an element of psychological pressure maintaining things across the year. But then when you get back into it, maybe depending on your goals, some guys might need to put on muscle, others might need to lose fat ahead of the season, things like that. So in either of those contexts, you're looking to deliver an anabolic signal, and so you're looking to resistance train. It'll be similar training whether you're looking to lose fat. If you're looking to lose fat, you'd go on a lower calorie diet, but you would still implement hypertrophy style training so that you're not going to lose muscle mass while you're dieting. Same thing if you're looking to gain muscle, similar training, but you're obviously going to eat more so that you're actually going to gain muscle. And then you'll do that for however long weeks, and then you'll probably include some aerobic training, so some general stuff, maybe some tempos, longer stuff. So further away from the season, you'll have maybe more extensive tempos, longer distances. But I don't think there's any. I'd be against kind of using just long distance straight off. So maybe avoiding the kind of 5Ks that are kind of very popular. But maybe just something like tempos, just the length of a pitch, jogging or walking across, something like that. So you have at least some intermittent nature to it. But it's, lower intensity, maybe 60-70% of your max speed at the start, and then work up a bit. But look, you don't want to be blowing the gasket too early, and using all the tools in the toolbox or all the tricks you have. And then slowly, just, as you're coming towards the season, then you might transition more when you've sorted your body composition. Maybe you've gained a bit of muscle you have, or you've lost a bit of fat. And then you can start to transition to strength and a bit of power.
At what time would that be? Like, would you start?
So we say if you're playing in March, we say, so maybe a month or two before that. So
okay.
January-ish, maybe the end of January, something like that, you can start to transition then to the strength, some power. You could maybe up the speed in your runs. You could include some other variables, and then moving towards the season, you're going to get stronger, more powerful. That's the goal. So you'll obviously have a high enough volume of gym work around that period. You're looking to develop, and same thing. You could start including some sprints as well the nearer you get, and then just think of what you need to have in the game to perform well, and then kind of reverse engineer back from that. And then near the season, then the kind of pre-season phase, you could look to some kind of sprint interval training, higher intensity stuff. As I said, the final 3 or 4 weeks, really improve that. Again, work on your running speed. So typical session there, you could have a number of runs, maybe 4 or 5 30-meter sprints, something like that. Plenty of rest in between, maybe 3 minutes plus. So you could do skill work there, and then you could go into some kind of sprint interval training. Maybe 8 runs, something like 120-ish meters, something like that. Maybe 5 or 6 turns, things like that. Get you ready for match play. And then obviously you'll be training away at that time. And then just once you have that block completed, and you feel you've obviously greatly improved your aerobic capacity, your running speed, things like that, you're in good shape in terms of your power, that give yourself maybe a deload week, things like that, ahead of the game or ahead of the league, and then you're into the league then, and kind of in towards the season then. So Jeez. That's just a general structure, I suppose, but that's
that's excellent. In fairness, there was a lot of details in that general structure, which is good. Like, I think a lot of people will take from that. What I would look at then is, because I know, let's say after league, then you're looking at obviously getting back into strength and then moving into power as you go back into your championship, because usually there isn't too much of a break between league and championship. Even with our season this year, the way it has worked is that it was going to be league semi-final, league final, and then championship 1 week after the next. Mm-hmm. That's what they were going to work it. But now they've actually changed it to have a Wednesday game and a Sunday game in the same week, which is a bit mad. But
it's challenging,
yeah, it's a lot, because they want to give lads a week off before championship. But a lot of those boys are hurling, so and the hurling week is right before it. But anyway, one thing actually that I wanted to go back to on periodization, and I think it goes in line with what if we're talking about adaptation, I think you need to look at periodization differently as well. And just the fact that you mentioned John Kiley's work there, do you know, if you go on a 6-week block, of a strength program, right, in my opinion, I think if you go on a 6-week block of a strength program, your next block should be 8 weeks. Isn't it? In my opinion, I'm saying I think that you need to get that, to get the extra stimulus adding that extra 2 weeks would make sense. The same as if like you can lift 100 kilo one time, you're going to try to lift 105 the next time once you take that rest week. Have you ever looked at that, or maybe looking at how long a strength block can be before it starts to get disadvantageous?
Yeah, I think anywhere between 4 and 8 weeks you're in a good place. So I suppose it depends on whether you're aggressively increasing or it's a slow kind of thing. You could extend it. I don't think it essentially, I think they're both equally good. Personally, I'll probably go with something like a 5 week, maybe 4 weeks building.
Yeah.
So I suppose the kind of template I use would probably be similar to what Dr. Mike Isertel would use. Just kind of progressing, reducing the RER. So maybe starting with 3 in the tank, whatever movements you're doing, then 2 in the tank the next week, and then 1, and then go for your max, and then have a deload week. You could like
for power or strength.
For this would be kind of more, I suppose, strength or even hypertrophy. You could do this, try and increase the stimulus.
Yeah.
And then power, obviously, you don't want to be going with say too near. You obviously want to have a high velocity and things like that. So there'll be kind of a different focus for that. But something like that, just that you're increasing the stimulus week on week. You're not, employing the same thing. But with that, you do need to be disciplined in that you're tracking everything you're doing. You should maybe record at least what weights you're doing. Some guys just kind of go in a bit blind, but make sure that you're increasing the stimulus, but obviously not at the expense of form or anything like that. And you could potentially, as you were going along the weeks there, add a set or 2 here. So maybe start at 3 sets and then a week or 2 later go to 4 sets. And obviously then the magnitude of the stimulus, as you're training harder and harder each week, you're going to progress further. And then once you're at your limit, we'll say then the following week have a deload, clear the fatigue, and then you can start the next block
and go at it again.
Yeah.
So you're breaking it down even into like a weekly thing, as opposed to even looking at the what are they called, microcycles, is it? 8 week cycles or 6 week cycles or whatever. So you're breaking it down week on week and looking at the reps and reserve side of things. That has to be one of the best analogies or whatever to come out of training that I've heard in a long time, that reps and reserve. And I've been using it for a good few years now, but I think that's such an effective mechanism, because it takes into account, obviously when you know what your weights are and you're writing them down, you can see how you're getting on, but it takes into account all the other factors that contribute to fatigue outside of the gym. So 1 week you might be able to lift 80 for 6 and you might have 2 in reserve, and the next week then it could be 70 or 78 or 79, and you can see that there's a drop off there. So there's obviously other layers of fatigue that are adding to it. I think that reps in reserve is applicable across the board. I think it's so good to manage, because you can see physically how you're being affected as well. Obviously you should be getting stronger each week, but when your things are starting to drop off, it's time to look at all the other factors. That's what I found anyway with the guys that I work with. No,
definitely. I'd be of a similar opinion. I think it's rather than percentage based. I think it's better in that regard. Like, look, obviously there's pros and cons to it. Same as Anthony, really. Lads might be able to gauge exactly where they are in terms of. But if you have a high enough experience, your kind of limits in certain things. You'll be able to you can really just sit down, plan it out a bit, and things like that, and you should have an idea. But even I think as you said, the layered of fatigue. That's certainly it's brilliant in that regard. It'll take that into account. If you are fatigued, things will go down. But if you're feeling good and you're going for 2 RER, you might be able to push it a bit or whatever. But on the other hand as well, if you've looking at your 5 week block, and if you're looking at your work schedule or whatever, you've fairly consistent. You're not expecting any extra fatigue. You should have a good idea that you're going to be fairly consistent fatigue wise. You can possibly maybe plan it out the first week. Okay, start, gauge yourself there. This is 3 RER, and then beyond that you could just probably add 2.5 kilos each week, whatever it is. If you're expecting to be of a similar preparedness across the board, then you'll be able to make your target there and work up from that. But of course the RER does give you that freedom if you are fatigued or beat up from something else external, that you can adapt and you can give yourself what you need in terms of your training and stimulus.
How do you explain it to a client? How do you explain it to a player how to use RIR effectively?
Yeah, I think especially with younger guys, there might be more explaining in it, but sometimes there's different things you can look at, but they'll often tend to have a good idea of if I've 2 or 3 left here. Obviously if you're going 4 or 5, it's more challenging to know exactly where you are. But once you're going 3 or less, things are fairly good. They should have a good enough idea. But of course you will have some variability. Some guys might be overshooting or undershooting. But look, I suppose that's the challenges of working in team sport. You've so many guys to be dealing with. But you do just try and teach it as best you can, and you can nearly look at them as well and have a good idea, and just conversing with them and say, look, had you definitely tuned the tank there, or was there a bit more or less? So there is certainly a bit of feeling around to see exactly where they are. But once you kind of assist them that way, you should have a good idea, I think, going forward with it.
Yeah, and it's good when you have boys who are like, especially in a county setup where the majority of lads are going to be disciplined and going to push on and stuff like that. But if you're doing that in a club setup where you have lads who are kind of just, they're training away to play away and stuff like that, it's a small bit harder to monitor that, because they'll be less inclined to do so. And I think everyone even knows it themselves. When you go to the gym and you're just not feeling up for getting a session in, trying to push a 2 RIR or 1 IR in every exercise is tough. Like, it's tough on the body, it's tough on the mind, especially where you're kind of not as interested in it. So yeah, I think that's a huge one. And for people, I suppose, who don't know, who are listening, what we're talking about is reps in reserve. As Lorcan said there, is like, if you feel that let's say if you're doing 5 reps, and if you feel at the 5 rep mark that you can do another 5 reps, then that's probably 5 reps in reserve. So you need to either up your weight to bring it down to, if you're under a guideline of 2 reps in reserve, you have to up your weight to bring it back down. So it could be you can do 10 reps at 60, you can do 8 reps at 70, you can do 6 reps, or let's say 7 reps at 80, and you're going for a 5 rep with a 2 RIR. That's your 80s your marked in, because you could, when you hit 5 reps, it feels like you'll fail if you do 2 more. So that's what you got to stick it at. Now that was an arse way of explaining it, but in a basic sense, I think hopefully you'll get an idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's it. I suppose another thing that can help as well, if rather than giving a specific, go for 5 here, give them a range, maybe go between 6 and 8, something like that.
Wow,
and then you should be using the RIR rather than a rep target, because they might get to 6 and be like, alright, I'm at 6, call it off, whereas realistically they could have done 9 or 10. But if they see 6 written down, they might tend to go for that. So just make sure you give them a range and say, look, go off the reps in the tank rather than the number.
Okay.
It's better to be within a range but at the right RER than the other way around, I think. So.
Oh really? Okay, good.
So remember that as well, yeah.
Oh, and your range would probably be 2 reps. Like, you wouldn't put a range of 5 to 9, would you?
You probably want them in a kind of, maybe in a strength zone. You might want 3 to 5, something like that, or depending on whatever. Obviously hypertrophy, you might have a bit more leeway, but something, just give them a ballpark idea and let them know, just to follow their actual rep in the tank rather than the number target, maybe more. So.
And does it work? Obviously it does, but do you feel it works the same for hypertrophy then, as opposed to saying, alright, you need to hit 6 sets of this or 8 sets? Well, obviously I know you have to hit a good amount of sets with hypertrophy, but does the same, would you use the same technique
for hypertrophy? Oh, definitely. I definitely include it. I think it's highly applicable there, because the fact that you can would say increase the stimulus over time quite easily, and it's clean cut, it's easy to deliver, it accounts for all these variables, individualization, as we said, and the fact that with hypertrophy across a 5-week block, you're probably, I suppose, for training to be productive, you want it to be 2 things. You want it to be within a range that's causing enough stimulus for you to, we say, grow or whatever, but you also want it to be progressive. So when you think backwards from that, the fact that it needs to be within a range, it also needs to be progressing. That means if you go hell for leather at your max in week 1, it's impossible to be progressive, because you can't go any more than that. So you want to start at the lower end, maybe work a bit up each week. Obviously you don't want to start so low that it's too easy. It wants to be hard enough, start at that point and then work up so it's progressive, and then maybe hit your limit in the last week.
Oh really? Okay.
So you're ticking 2 boxes there, that number 1, it's enough to get you to grow, and number 2, it's progressing.
Okay.
So and once you follow that logic, it kind of falls into place then with the programming.
So how would that work then, to look at, like, let's say someone is doing hypertrophy and they're on the bench, let's say over a 4-week block, how would you use that RIR, that situation?
Yeah, so I suppose a lot of the research looking at it is that once you're kind of around 4 or above, or we say, so once you're hitting beyond that threshold of 4 in the tank,
okay,
you're probably stimulating enough that you're going to improve. So looking at your example there with 100 kilos, so you might say, right, 100 kilos, I I could do 10 reps, and week 1 you do 6 reps, that's leaving 1 in the tank. So that's probably your starting point there. So then next week you could go 100 kilos for 7 reps, that's 3 in the tank. Following week then 8 reps, 2 in the tank. Last week, then we could go 9 reps, 1 in the tank, and then you might progress to 10 reps, something like that.
Okay.
Alternatively, you can add loads, so you can go, so 100 kilos is 4 in the tank for me. Next week I'll go 102.5, that'll be 3 in the tank. And then 105, 2 in the tank, 107, and then I might reach my limit there at 110, something like that. So many ways to do it, whether you're adding load or whatever. So in more of a strength phase, you're probably going to want to add load rather than add reps. You might get out of the kind of rep zone you're looking for.
Yeah.
So maybe hypertrophy, you have the option really. You can add a rep, or you can add load, or you can do a mix. But basically, once you're turning the screw, for want of a better term, over the weeks, and then you're kind of reaching your limit there the last week.
Okay, all right, okay. That's good. That's an interesting one, yeah, especially with the way you were saying that you can either up your reps, keep it at the same weight and up the reps, which I think in a lot of situations can be better for, do you know, if you're benching by yourself.
Yeah.
So it's actually a lot safer to do it that way.
Exactly, yeah.
Where you know you're comfortable doing it as opposed to upping the weight and getting stuck. Because, Jesus, there's nothing worse. Remember the time the two of us were above an athlone and we were gymming and I was on the bench and I couldn't get it up and you slipped off the step.
Oh, yeah, you're kind of,
the two boys,
that step, you're kind of leaning over.
The two boys then trying to, oh, jeez, we were dogging at a weight, but it wasn't too heavy anyway, so it wasn't too bad. But I think half
it was 3 plates either side for.
That was it.
Something like that, yeah.
I think it was the laughing that killed us, though. The two of us started laughing and then we couldn't get it up there after. But lucky there was someone looking on.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that was a long time ago now. Jesus, that's a long time ago. But yeah, that I think that's an interesting one with the periodization. And for hypertrophy, from that side of things, I know, was it you that we were discussing this before about a lot of it is actually to do with the amount of sets you do on a given muscle group. Was it me and you talking about that before?
I think possibly.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it was like, I remember you had shown me a guy who was talking about it to give me a better example of it first. Mm-hmm. So what's that? Could you break that down into, let's say, a minute of a 2 minutes of a? Yeah.
So I think in terms of, you know, like the currency or how much dose you want to administer, it's probably just, we say, the amount of hard sets really. You know, the kind of older methods of doing it is tonnage, you know, weights by reps by sets, whatever. But kind of the main logic now that's primarily followed is just the amount of hard sets delivered. So the amount of sets, excluding, we said, the warm-up, whatever, that are in that zone of whatever X amount of reps in the tank, your working sets, for want of a better term, the amount of those. And we say to increase the stimulus, you might add a set or two here or there. But there is kind of guidelines that you shouldn't have sets maybe overly high, or obviously not enough sets, you won't be getting as much of a gains. And things like that. But in general, what you'll see in any kind of physiological adaptations, whatever, it'll take a high enough dose to improve. But once you kind of reach that higher standard, it'll take a very low dose. So even though some studies, even a ninth of the dose is enough to nearly maintain. So once you get to a good level of strength or power, or probably more so even hypertrophy, even a third of the dose, it'd be probably more than enough just to maintain where you are, all else being equal. So it's just important, I suppose, to know that it takes a lot to improve, but once you get there, you can maintain it fairly easy.
An easy level. Okay, so let's say, take myself for an example. So I moved back from Bali a couple of weeks ago, last week actually, but I know this podcast won't be out for another few months. But I basically moved out from Bali last week. I got dengue fever 3 weeks before that, so I was off the cards for 2 weeks. So I only got maybe one session in, but I had been gymming for the, let's say, 3 months before that. So I feel that my strength has gone back a good bit, it would, because I lost a good bit of weight as well with that. So how long are you looking at before you can start to get your strength back to the levels that I would have had it before? Taken that I have been off for, let's say, 4 weeks, being pretty sick with different things and just traveling and moving around. To get back up to that same level or similar level, how long would it take?
I'd say maybe 3 or 4 weeks, something like that. You'll probably be more or less back, I'd say. But a mistake that's often done, myself included, is the first session back, you need to really go an awful lot lighter than you think.
Really, yeah.
Because you'll absolutely cripple yourself on the first session, which is, I think, something myself and a lot of people do after maybe a break of 2 weeks. You might just kind of go back what you think is the light session, but you'll actually be surprised how sore you could be after it. So you just certainly want to get back, ease back into it, and then progress over the few weeks. And I'd say 3 or 4 weeks you'll probably be back to 90+% anyways.
Really? Yeah, that's not bad. Jeez,
yeah,
that's
so
in good time.
It does come back quick anyways, yeah.
And how is that? Is it because of the neurological side of it?
Yeah, there's I can't think of the word now, but there is I can't think what they're called, but it does come back quick. All right, it's an awful lot quicker than what it would take you to gain muscle in the first place. Once you gain it and lose it, it comes back much quicker. I can't think of the name of the things within the muscle cells now.
Oh, the actin and myosin, is it?
No, it slipped my mind altogether. But essentially, there is mechanisms there that once you have had it,
is that
they come back.
That's not satellite cells, is it?
Yes, they're part of it as well.
Are they? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so I'm not too far off it. 3 weeks.
No, it'll come back quick. Yeah.
Sound.
Yeah.
How about I've been off for the last year and a half and I haven't done much sprinting.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a little bit of sprinting, playing 7 aside, but I haven't done a whole lot. How fast are we talking about that coming back? Like, I have done gym sessions, I've done heavy gym sessions, but obviously it's not the same as speed.
No, definitely not. I suppose, you're back training again. So I'd look to maybe start with a few sprints, 80 to 90%, and then slowly work up, maybe add another sprint or two here until you're back to maybe 3 or 4 max effort sprints with a few minutes between them, and just to slowly condition yourself. So it is very hard to replicate sprinting in the gym. You can obviously work hamstrings and all that, but it's just not quite the same. It's a very unique kind of movement pattern, and that's why there's a lot of work looking at. Obviously injuries occur during sprinting, but it's regular inclusion of sprinting, obviously not over or undercooking them, but regular inclusion of sprinting is what's going to protect you against injury, that you're conditioned to face the demands of a sprint. So it is just a slow thing, same as Anthony. You ease into it, start at the lower end of intensity and volume, work up, and kind of get back to where you were.
Okay, but I'm looking to get back to full speed though.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a way of, because I have been doing sprinting, like my, let's say, anaerobic fitness isn't it's not great, but it's not too bad.
Okay.
So the legs have been turning over, but just not at 100%.
Yeah.
So maybe, let's say, in 7 aside, you're probably getting up to 60 or 70%, maybe 80% sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So to get back to 100%, would you say do your sprints at the start of training, before the training even kicks off, before you're fatigued?
Yeah, I definitely. I'd certainly avoid them when you're fatigued, anyways. So maybe just include them. Do the warm up. I included some acceleration work in the warm up, things like that. And then even just you'd probably hit max speed 30 meters, maybe. If you're higher level, maybe up to 35, 40, something like that. But by 40 meters, you should be certainly at 100% speed.
Okay.
So you could be looking to that distance. I typically use with 30 meters. After warm-up, maybe include 2 or 3 sprints like that, and that'd be enough of a training stimulus. I'd say you can add to it over time.
Oh, good. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, that's solid. I'll introduce that this evening then. Jesus, Larko, that's perfect. I think we're just over the hour mark now. So I suppose that's probably everything that we would run through. That was I think we covered a lot of that for all types of athletes, and the stuff that Lorcan was talking about there with the strength training and the hypertrophy training, and that's not just applicable to GAA players or football players. That's the same principles apply for rugby players and runners and stuff. It obviously need to be adapted slightly to your sport and that, but in general, it's very practical advice that you can start to implement straight away. And especially when this podcast will be coming out, it'll be moving, depending on when it comes out, it'll be moving more towards the off season. So I would definitely go back, get a bit of a map on that. And kind of plan out your season for the months ahead, because you can definitely look at. I know you were dead right in saying that you should take a bit of time off first to kind of clear the head and clear the body, and maybe try out something new in the off season. But if you're looking to get back into it, make sure that you're following the advice and the guidelines that he laid out there. And definitely reach out to. You're active on Twitter. You were saying more so than.
I think Twitter probably the more so. Lorcan Daly 10. I also have that Instagram page.
The games research.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. I haven't logged in now. So a long
probably
time.
Not the best place to get in contact.
No. Yeah. So maybe a notification will appear or something. I'm not too sure, but.
Oh, that's true. Actually, yeah.
So, but I wouldn't bank on it.
So Twitter is a hard man to get in contact with. If anyone has any questions, just send them on to me, and I'll send them on to him as well. because we do keep in contact. So I think that's everything for this week, man.
Perfect. Thanks a million.
Yeah, thanks man yourself for jumping on, and it's great to have you around. Good to get a bit of sauna done last night and a bit of swimming done. So yeah, next time you're down, we'll definitely get another podcast done as well, because the in person I think is so much nicer
Definitely
than the Zoom, isn't it? You can really chat about things. Perfect. But that's everything, guys, from us today. Thanks a million for listening. I hope everyone out there is doing well, and make sure to follow this on Spotify and iTunes, and make sure to rate it as it promotes the podcast, and leave a comment or share it on your stories. That goes along with promoting it as well. But thanks a million for Lorcan for jumping on. Thanks a million, guys, for listening, and I'll leave you all for this week. Have a good one.